So, welcome once more. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar from Insignia, Planning for Business Resilience During Geoeconomic Conflict. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We are a specialist crisis management consultancy working with leaders of businesses around the world to help them plan, train and rehearse for the worst days of their business lives. Clearly, the risk landscape is ever changing, and it's certainly true that right now we are at a moment of profound global turbulence from a geoeconomic perspective. We knew that this topic would be of interest when we scheduled it before Christmas. Nothing that has happened so far in 2026 suggests that this is not a very relevant subject for those responsible for crisis and risk management to be thinking about and hearing about. And to help us make sense of that landscape, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Rebecca Harding, CEO of the Centre for Economic Security. She's one of the world's leading thinkers in this area, and also the author of The Weaponization of Trade and The World at Economic War. The latter was chosen by Martin Wolf as one of the FT Books of the Year in 2025. And Rebecca's going to be helping us to explore how the global economy has become a tool of power and a tool of war, and what emerging and escalating economic risks may be presenting themselves to the people and the organizations on this call. And we hope that by the end of the hour, you'll have just a little bit more understanding of what's going on, what may happen next, and what you can do to be ready to mitigate that risk. So, Rebecca, thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to set 2 or 3 words of context and then hand it over to you. Again, for the audience, we'll be taking questions, or rather dealing with questions at the end. Please put your questions within the chat box within your control panel, and we will put those to Rebecca at the end of the session. But a little bit of context. Again, I don't think anyone will have missed that Davos took place over the last week, and as part of Davos, the World Economic Forum always issues its annual global risk report. And for the first time ever, geoeconomic confrontation was voted by the 1,600 key influencers, economists, parliamentarians, business people as the #1 short-term risk. Above cyber comes in at 6, weather events #4. So geoeconomic confrontation right at the top of the tree in terms of what people are seeing as the most critical and severe global risk. What's also telling is that it was also the fastest escalating risk, up 18 places right to the top of the tree. What I also found interesting, though, is that that was the risks right now over the last 2 years. When people are asked, what do you believe is the severity of risks in the longer term, it drops right out of that chart. It is no longer represented on the top 10 risks. So I guess my first kind of starter for 10 is to ask you, Rebecca, are you surprised by geopolitical turmoil being at the top of the charts, and/or are you surprised by the fact it's not in the chart for long-term global risk?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the kind words by way of introduction. So the short answer to that is no, I'm not surprised. The world is facing probably the biggest systemic threat to the international post-war economic order that it has seen in the last 80 years. We've had Cold War, we've had all sorts of things, but actually the truth of the matter is that that we have never seen an economic conflict like this. And why do I say that there is an economic conflict going on that's tantamount to economic warfare? If you think about what we are actually going through at the moment, all the levers of power economically are being used coercively to gain strategic influence, if you like, and strategic power over different ways of operating economic systems. And I'll come on to this in a little while, but the great powers are basically saying, we don't like what we built over the last 80 years. And anyway, most of it was America and Europe, and China and Russia aren't that happy with it. So finally, we are explicitly saying we don't want this anymore. Now that represents a huge threat. My concern with the World Economic Forum is that it tends to react, forgive me for what I'm about to say, to what's in the newspapers at the current time when the survey is done. What's interesting about the long term is that the long term actually has barely changed at all on last year, barely changed. I mean, the 5 natural resources, climate type things are still there. But what's interesting is that geoeconomics, which wasn't a thing 2 years ago, 4 years ago, we were barely talking about geoeconomic conflict, is suddenly something that is being used in newspapers. And I've actually been talking about this. Weaponization was published in 2017. And at the time, I was seen as a complete crank. And as somebody who was really talking about life in a way that people didn't particularly want to understand, because I was talking about trade weaponization and trade being used coercively. What's happened since President Trump was elected is that these types of geopolitical elements of everything have started to become self-evident. So, I mean, what I would say here and now is that we are in a position where the world is just not the same as it was. We've got all of these various things happening. So I would say America is explicitly saying that it's going to break things. We knew it was going to break things. We knew a year ago it was going to break things. So quite why the World Economic Forum wasn't saying this is a problem a year ago is a mystery, because as soon as President Trump was elected, it was quite clear that the international rules-based order was not going to be the same. But let's have a think about what's actually changing now. The US government has quite explicitly stated, and over the last year has implemented policies that are deliberately and directly to undermine the parameters of globalization and the international rules-based order. And the World Economic Forum has always stood for globalization and the international rules-based order. What is the international rules-based order? Well, we in Europe have always assumed that this is an America-led, US dollar-based system of multilateralism with global institutions, global rules that will govern our liberal free markets. And what we're seeing now is actually an assault on our assumptions about liberal free markets and democracy coming from Russia, China, and the United States, and not just. And this is something that in Europe we are struggling with. And why is this happening? It's happening because, obviously, the US sees a major trade deficit. This has been around. It's been talking about this for a very long time, and it thinks that is because of unfair practices. So economic warfare is the right way to go about an economic problem, if you like. You don't solve it with military, you solve it with the economic things. And just one thing that's really worth mentioning here, this is a goods deficit. America actually has a surplus in services trade. Now, why is that important? America actually mistrusts its own surplus in services trade, because although it's nearly 300 billion US dollars, so it's significant as a surplus, what it means is America feels that its intellectual property has been hollowed out, that its investment has been hollowed out, that it's actually been, if you like, taken over. Its ideas have become taken over by competitive forces, adversarial forces, and it sees a material strategic threat with China on all of this. So what it sees now, of course, is DeepSeek, the AI threat. It wasn't an accident that DeepSeek came out with its announcement on Liberation Day to say that DeepSeek was able to produce AI technologies cheaper and just as effectively. But there's another very important aspect of all of this, which is the America First Investment Memo. What we're seeing in the America First Investment Memo is very large organisations actually having to pass their investments abroad by national security frameworks in order to get them approved. So everything investment-wise is being done, and I have that from senior bankers in the United States. And of course, you're beginning to see the building up of crypto assets, stable coins that may or may not be US dollar based. The US is beginning to use Bitcoin as a reserve currency. And for its reserves, and it's beginning to undermine the independence of the Fed as well. So what we're seeing is huge economic challenges to the way in which our international rules-based order in Europe works, but then also how we see it multilaterally as well. And just to reinforce, multilateral organisations are part of this international rules-based order, especially the big multilateral banks, NATO, the United Nations, the European Union, and the US is deliberately withdrawn from some of these. It withdrew from a number of committees last week in NATO, or the week before in NATO. It's withdrawn from 68 different aspects of various climate treaties. It's undermining a lot, either rhetorically or actually physically, by withdrawing its funding or its presence in a lot of these multilateral organisations. And that's been going on, but it was quite clear that this was going to happen. So, as I say, I'm not surprised that geoeconomics is at the top, because it's a very important thing. And it's become more explicit as America has gone through this process with its national security strategy and its defence strategy and so on. But what's amazing to me is that we weren't already aware of that. And I'll come on to that in a minute. And what we need to be aware of is that for some years now, it's been quite apparent that China, America and Russia actually have very similar attitudes to the world economic order. So what that means, and I think this is the next slide, what that means is that
we're just going to make one quick aside on this, Rebecca, and it's a broader aside really for the risk and crisis managers on this call. You talked, very accurately and very powerfully about assumptions and rules which people have based their understanding and actions around the global economy on for decades. I'd just like say the risk and crisis managers on this call to be thinking about that a little more broadly as well. What are the other assumptions and rules that we might believe are sacrosanct that are underpinning our approach to risk management, not just within economic risks, but more broadly? It's very easy to end up 5 or 10 steps behind what's really happening if you are too wedded to what you think you absolutely know for sure. And what I'd also say is it's probably not the people on this call, but maybe your C-suite that may be wedded to those assumptions and those rules. So, what Rebecca is talking about is how those geoeconomic rules are being thrown out. Make sure that you are being equally open-minded about the broader risk landscape. So.
Absolutely, and I think what I would say to that is I will show you a slide at the end that tells you how we need to be thinking about all of this, but it's about preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. And I think one of the complacencies that we've had in Europe in particular is that there are a lot of things that we have just taken for granted. And I think one of the things, and I spend a lot of time in Germany and speaking to Germans and everything, and looking at the change in civil society and the attitudes towards where they are. Germany is going through the most existential shock it's had in probably nearly 100 years. It's very, very profound what's going on in Germany at the moment, and suddenly realizing that we cannot always assume peace, because the whole of the post-war era has assumed peace, and it's assumed peace because our institutions in Europe are set up to guarantee peace. That's what the Treaty of Rome was, and then we've had an American nuclear umbrella over us, and while we see our own economic power levers weakened, and I'll come on to that, you know, we're in a position where we actually have huge vulnerabilities, and I think that's where our risk thinking needs to go. So, I mean, it's very easy at the present time to say this is all about America, and it's very easy, certainly since the Munich Security Conference last year, to say, my goodness gracious me, look at the size of this shock, look at what we're going to have to do, and this is all about America. It's not all about America. Actually, what we're seeing at the moment is China, Russia, and the United States talking a very similar type of language. And it's the BRICS nations as well. They're all saying this international rules-based order, it doesn't work for the BRICS because it means borrowing from the IMF on Western US dollar-based terms, which isn't necessarily what is ideal for them. It means using the US dollar. Even some of the big structures associated with BRICS are still US dollar based. And so what's happening is this whole move away from understanding the world as we have constructed it after Bretton Woods, and towards a mechanism where we start to understand it as actually very fundamentally flawed. Now in Europe, of course, our interests are best held together by this whole thing holding together and protecting it and protecting our values. And we believe profoundly, because of our philosophical and political history going back to the year dot, literally, we believe in this process of democracy and the free markets that are around it. But if you look at what's similar now between what, as sort of figureheads, Russia, China and the United States are all saying, they're all saying they dislike global institutions, right? So the big global institutions not suitable anymore, not lending, not working in the way that they should. Interestingly, the BRICS quite like the United Nations, but America certainly doesn't like the United Nations. And what's been really interesting is America has been voting with some of the very strange countries like North Korea and Iran in some of the decisions that have been made. All of those three powers like to project their power economically. Now, people say to me, what on earth do you mean Russia is not an economic powerhouse? Russia might not be an economic powerhouse, but Russia is a commodity powerhouse and an economic disruptor. So what Russia is able to do within this entire framework is influence commodity prices, hard and soft commodity prices. And one of the things that made me realize that we were seeing this whole weaponization of trade and strategic warfare starting to build up was the fact that back in 2014-15, Russia started investing in grain production, grain exports. It hadn't been up to that point, and nobody really realized how important the grain market was to Russia until Russia invaded Ukraine, and until it became very difficult to get hold of grain products because Russia had restricted grain exports from Ukraine and actually was restricting its own supply onto global markets as well. And of course that has an impact over North Africa, has an impact on Russia, because an awful lot of Russian and Ukrainian grain goes into North Africa, has an impact on food security around the world. And these are all economic levers. So we think of Russia as disinformation and disruption, but we need to think about Russia in economic terms as well. And then finally, what I would say is really important on this point is that all three countries with their aspirations, and we can talk about hemispheric control or rather than dollar hegemony or whatever we want to talk about, but all of them have a very significant control, increasing control over corporates. Now, one of the things that has been super interesting over the last couple of years, and I've been obviously studying this for a long time, but one of the things that's been super interesting is 2 years ago, I ran a workshop through the Centre for Economic Security on how we inputted into the Strategic Defence Review in the UK. And one of the things we wanted to say, all of us on this call, was that, you know, there is an economic war going on, and we need to have these types of conversations with corporates about what their balance between a national security role is and their fiduciary duty. And everybody went, but we're Western power, we don't believe that there should be anything other than fiduciary duty. Shareholder interests are in the interests of everybody. That's our Adam Smith free market economy thinking, and that's how we go about these things. But if you look at the narrative and how it's changed over the last few months in the United States, actually the corporates are beginning to be either partly owned by government or absolutely talking the same language. The opposition from corporates to what's going on has actually been fairly minimal. So America is very much along this line of, well, we have a national security threat. We see it in economic terms. We're talking about national security and make America great again in that order. They're interdependent, and we need our corporates to be aligned. And there's been a huge rallying cry around all of this, and that is significant because it's very different to what we expect from our corporates and from our financial services institutions who are global in Europe. It's very different. So that type of conversation is changing. And again, it's an aspect of warfare that we're not even thinking about, because we assume that fiduciary duty is the one thing that we have as a power lever. In actual fact, fiduciary duty undermines the extent to which we can use our corporate levers to fight national security causes for us. So it's become a deep concern. So what I would say from all of that is, if you think about this logically, you can't possibly assume that business is usual. It really, really isn't. And what do I mean by that? We've got sanctions and tariffs. That's absolutely clear. They've been around actually since 2016, 2017. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, they became a real focal point of how we were fighting a military war, because we wanted to use tools that wouldn't invoke mutually assured destruction through nuclear weapons. So America and NATO, all NATO allies, were agreed that we imposed economic sanctions, and this has been using trade coercively and actually militarily to fight a campaign against Russia. But of course, what we've seen in the last year is trade becoming nationally strategic as well. If you read the national security strategy of the United States, or if you read any of the documents around Belt and Road or China's internal and external circulation, they are all about how trade is being used strategically, how it's being used as coercive mechanisms. And so we've also seen from all of this trade and finance. So trade finance is a very large component of the value of international trade, around 80–90%. And trade finance has become more digital. It's become it's become cross-border. It's become easier to do. AI is becoming part of that whole framework in terms of fraud checking, etc., etc. So finance and tech are right in the middle of this whole trade dimension to economic warfare, and trade is actually the vector, and payments are the vector through which all of this is going. So if you think about SWIFT, when Russia invaded Ukraine, in the West we used SWIFT as a mechanism for excluding Russia. Well, of course, what's happened since then is SWIFT has actually, with China, launched the Chinese interbank payment system, which has been around for decades, but it's now explicitly trading in the Asia region in renminbi and not in the US dollar. So we're beginning to see that weakening of the capacity to use sanctions coercively, and a rebalancing of dollar hegemony, if you like, in the international trade system. And one of the things that happened as soon as China announced that, and it was 18 months ago now, the banks agreed, and HSBC, it's in the public domain, decided that its Asia Pacific trade was going to go through the SIP system rather than the SWIFT system, because it's easier, it's got less friction in it. So finance and tech has become part of this as well. And then what that means is that underneath all of this, the flow of data, the flow of money, the flow of payments is weaponized, because who controls the data and the information behind those digital flows is actually the owner, if you like, of the 21st century. So is it great power competition? Of course, America sees a huge threat, because its own interdependencies, its own control of information is now very much threatened by a similar, equal but opposite control from China. And that's affecting global institutions. And so how do corporates manage that risk? It's about flexibility, it's about adaptiveness, it's about managing the unexpected, because all of this underneath is highly weaponized, if not actually literally war, because China and Russia and the United States have actually declared their intent. They want to disrupt and break this system.
Yeah, just again, one broader point on your phrase, managing the art of managing the unexpected. And I think those of you on the call that have worked with us know that we're big advocates for risk agnostic crisis management planning. We cannot predict every risk, and so a purely playbook based approach to risk management around known risks means that you probably will not be successful in managing the unexpected risks. So yeah, some broader thinking, some risk agnostic planning, I think is really important within this really challenging economic environment.
Absolutely. And one thing I would say on that is I often, people used to talk about black swans as sort of unexpected events that, you know, you can't hedge against because they're unexpected. And I think where we are at the moment is actually in a world of grey rhinos. We know they're there. We see them all the time. We should see them coming because they're big and they hurtle towards us at the rate of knots. And instead of thinking about this in terms of black swans, think about it in terms of these being grey rhinos. The world is changing, and what's bizarre about where we are at the moment is that markets are ridiculously strong. There are weird things happening with gold at the moment, and you know, opinion is divided around all of that, but actually markets are doing well. There's no imminent sense of economic crisis around all of this. It's economic warfare. It isn't creating economic recession. You know, this is one of the bizarre things. And so the temptation is to say, well, what's the problem then? Why do we need to worry? Why do we need to open this box which has just got too difficult labelled on it? Let's carry on business as usual. And to some extent, you know, the assumptions around taco trades, you know, Trump always chickens out. You saw the market reaction last week when Trump pulled back, and you know, the sort of self-satisfied almost way in which market commentators comment on the fact that, oh, it's all okay, it's chickened out again. But what we're missing is the extent to which that has actually undermined the international rules-based order and what we've taken for granted. So, I mean, I think, and the reason why I love this particular chart is because it's actually taken from George Orwell's 1984. So if you look at hemispheric control and you look at the world of trade, this picture actually tells you where the big threats are in the international domain at the moment. So what you have is obviously tariffs. You've got blockades going on. This is Venezuela. You've got a digital conflict between a renminbi and Bitcoin. You've got those types of things building up. Central bank digital currencies and the build-up of digital reserves in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, it's absolutely colossal. America has said it's going to defend the Panama Canal. And that's one of its priorities. But why are we actually ultimately interested in the Arctic Circle? Let's take a look at this picture. Let's think about it in terms of hemispheric control. The Arctic Circle and Greenland is absolutely critical to this. And what we're beginning to see is China beginning to take cargo ships through. There was one landed at Felixstowe just before Christmas. And we're not even looking up there. I started running war games on Arctic Circle trade 2.5 years ago, and people thought I was, again, a conspiracy theorist, absolutely nutty, because I was saying, you know, if Arctic ice caps melt at the rate that they are melting, then we are going to see trade wars going through the Arctic Circle. Let's say, for example, China decided to invest in the ports in Finland and in Norway and in Scotland, Aberdeen, for example, and started to say, right, all the trade through the Northern Sea route, through the Arctic Circle, has got to be done on the SIP system using the digital renminbi. Where would the US dollar be there? And what would happen if the US suddenly started, and these were war games I was running 2 years ago, don't forget, what would happen if China, if Canada started to say, well, we have to be part of this because we're a near Arctic nation and we have to be trading in digital renminbi with the European Union as well? I was saying this 2 years ago, and I think one of the problems that we have, it goes back to this point about complacency. We haven't seen the dependency that we have on China in terms of supply chain resilience, in terms of rare earth metals. The Arctic Circle is now a premium target for President Trump because it is $1 trillion ocean, literally. The resources that are underneath it, it's not me that said that, it was Deloitte or KPMG or one of those organisations that said it a good few years ago. There are resources there, but then think about that in connection with how the trade routes are changing, how things are beginning to shift. Russia has got another icebreaker, and there's got more icebreakers up there. And it doesn't help climate either, because every single time an icebreaker goes through, it disrupts about 7 square meters of ice. And turns it into ice cubes, sorry, 7 square miles of ice, and it turns it into ice cubes, so it melts more quickly. So the more trade goes through, the more quickly it melts everything. And of course, in addition to all of that, Russia has a very significant nuclear presence in the Arctic as well. So this map, which was drawn by George Orwell back in the 1930s, is actually very accurately representing a huge amount of what we're witnessing at the moment, hemispheric control. And so I know a few people who talk about great power collaboration because it's in Russia's interest for America to be interested in the Arctic Circle, because it has spent so much money on its war effort in Ukraine that its resources and its oil fields in the Arctic Circle are now depleted and need significant investment. That's why Trump sees Europe as a challenge and not Russia and China. So all of this is beginning to affect the way in which we can manage our macroeconomies, because Europe is very restricted, except for Germany. Europe is very restricted in terms of the extent to which it can borrow from markets. The UK, we've seen all of this. Any hint that the government might be borrowing more money and the markets go crazy. And we need to look at who's making those decisions in their markets. It's not the invisible hand anymore. There are very important state-led interests within those markets because of the role of treasuries, etc., etc. So it's also affecting our investment landscape. As I said earlier, we've got this America First investment memo that has fundamentally changed the way in which investors are able to allocate capital around the world and want to allocate capital around the world. But then if you think about what China is doing with the Belt and Road, and you know, back in the day, sort of talking ancient history now, about 5 years ago, I went into one of the major banks in London, and it wasn't one you think it would be, but it said one bank, one belt, one road. And so it's talking about that one bank being the Belt and Road provider, and it was a British bank, not the one you think it is. And what's interesting about that is we all wanted to be part of this investment growth that was going to be Belt and Road. And now look at where we are. So this whole fluid world of where we are in terms of our economic relationships and our economic partnerships, they're all being changed, and technology and digital finance is actually at the base of all of that. So just before I cheer you up completely, here's what I think the key to success is. I think it's something called managing unintentional blindness. Now you can see there a basketball player and a gorilla, and this is the what I think we need to overcome if we're going to manage the world of the unexpected. Now the psychology experiment is this: you have two basketball players, and they stand at the front of the stage, and they are passing basketball between them, and the audience is asked to count the number of basketball passes between the two basketball players at the front. Meanwhile, while the audience is busy counting all of those basketball passes, there is a huge gorilla, a la Derren Brown, that goes across the back of the stage. 52% of people will not see that gorilla because they'll be so busy counting the basketball passes. And the rest of them don't want to see the gorilla because they think the target is actually to count the basketball passes, and that's how they're going to win. That is where we are with international markets at the moment. And to your point earlier, Jonathan, about how we manage all of this and where we should be thinking about the unexpected, because it's going to happen every single day. And so we cannot afford to have this unintentional blindness. It is not an excuse anymore. And it's been mixed with intentional blindness as well. So a few years ago, I've set up 3 data companies, and I went into one of the banks selling this data into the bank as you do as an entrepreneur. And I said, this is really going to help you because it will tell you which goods you're trading, that are military goods, that are dual use goods, and it will tell you the location that it's going to and who trades what with whom. And they said, brilliant. We love that. From a geopolitical point of view, absolutely perfect. From a compliance point of view, don't want to know. And the reason why they didn't want to know was because if they knew, they had to do something about it. So this unintentional and intentional blindness has been endemic to our thinking in post-war Europe. We've just wanted to assume that everything is actually in the end going to be fine, and if it's not fine, it's not the end. And I think that is the danger. And the reality of where we are now is that whatever we think might happen probably will. Is the World Economic Forum correct to say that one of the biggest existential challenges we face, quite apart from war and conflict and economic conflict, is actually climate security? Absolutely, that hasn't changed. And you know, once we've dealt with all of this lot, and it won't be easy doing that, then we need to understand that there might not even be a planet left because of the things that we're not talking about at all anymore. We're talking about energy security and guns, and not ESG anymore. And yeah, that's new business as unusual. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating, very enlightening. We've already got a number of questions that have come in, Rebecca, and I have some as well. I guess one to kick us off from me is, I guess many, if not all, of the people on this call are trained and kind of enthusiastic about thinking the unthinkable because they are risk and crisis managers, and you know, we love a bit of scenario planning and wargaming and red teaming and all of that stuff. Any thoughts about how we can get the C-suite more engaged with that, the people, you know, right at the heart of power within corporations? How do we get them to engage with the grey rhinos?
So excellent question, and absolutely and utterly non-trivial, because it is the C-suite that need to be aware of all of this. Now, I for a long time have said we need to talk to government. We need corporates and finance and government to be in the same room as each other. The C-suite need to feel important, not because they are in a talking shop, but because they are briefed on all of these insecurities, buy into the fact that these are genuine insecurities, and can inform government about how they are seeing it from the coalface. Because one of the real things that I think is important here is that governments always say, yes, we're talking to industry. They don't say we're talking to finance necessarily, although increasingly they are. but one of the problems, as I said right at the beginning, the scale of all of this changes is so significant that people just want to put it in the too difficult box, and they feel as though they're just saying what they read in the Financial Times or the Economist, and you know, me saying what I've said today, everybody would say, yeah, but I read that. That was what Martin Wolf was saying last week. So what's new? Well, actually, what's new is the fact that it isn't new, if you see what I mean. And we've got to this problem by ignoring it. I think industry, and this is one of the things that we try to do in the Centre for Economic Security, I think one of the things we have to do is enable what I call Las Vegas conversations, Las Vegas rules. So I'm fed up with Chatham House rule. Lovely, it had its moment in time, but if I'm going to disrupt a big institution, then it's that. Because the thing about not attributing stuff but still being able to report on it is people still, the conversation gets blanded out. The most successful conversations I've had, which have been the most meaningful ones, have been between senior government officials, C-suite people, and people that are actually affected by anything that's being discussed on Las Vegas rules grounds. And what I mean by that is you shut the door. It doesn't matter if you're security cleared or not. You don't have to be, but you shut the door. And the purpose of the conversation is to do something. And then businesses feel as though they're not only briefed, they're also in the room and they are influencing. And as a result of some of those Las Vegas rules conversations, I have now set up a security and resilience fund to fund the SMEs in defence and finance that aren't getting money at the moment, because everybody goes, oh yeah, talking shops. They all say this is happening. It isn't happening. So now let's find out the reasons why, where people can actually be honest. And then and I wouldn't say who's been involved in these conversations, and I wouldn't say, you know, what's happened during those conversations, but what I can say is the outcome has been this fund that I am now setting up. So it means that you can start to create action-oriented conversations, and I think that's where, as risk officers, there's a huge responsibility. Wargaming is brilliant. Do we economically wargame? I don't think we do. We're not going, right, okay, so what happens if people can't access their bank accounts? Or what happens if you know, a very small port in Latin America has its supply of copper disrupted for a little while. You know, all of these types of things. We're not wargaming those types of things. And again, C-suites need to know those types of things, as well as what happens if Russia decides to go into Norway, you know, or Finland. The kinetic war is in lots of ways less imminent than the economic war that we're actually in. And I think if you say we're at economic war, and everybody's a little bit shocked for a minute, but then they realise the verity of that and want to do something about it and use the economic power levers.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to the first question from the audience, and I'd encourage anyone else that has questions to put them in. We've got two or three, in fact more than two or three already. So firstly from Sue, Rebecca, firstly an excellent presentation and so thought-provoking. What you outline is both significant in impact and complexity. How do you suggest the C-suite break things down to bite-sized manageable chunks to enable the challenging conversations to take place with agreed and realistic action points that are specific to their organisation?
So there is a map of almost like a matrix that the C-suite should be aware of. Supply chains, finance, what I'll call interlocking directorship, but management overlap between different bits. And I think putting a sort of a matrix of various risk structures together, I mean, we all know what they are, and saying where in our supply chain are we likely to be affected by this. I mean, we're used to those types of credit control conversations. We're used to those types of Risk management, well, you know, what's geopolitical risk in Hungary this week? Is it 4 or is it 5? You know, how does that affect? And we have a broad conversation, we all go away happy. And I'm trivializing it, and it isn't trivial now. And I think there is a general awareness, and I really do think that Davos changed things, actually. And I think an opening up of a mind to a C-suite mind to the idea that this is actually something that C-suite need to deal with. Where are the economic threats coming from? We are talking not about risk. Let's change the conversation. Let's talk about preparedness instead. Okay, so how do we build preparedness against anything? Because then the World Economic Forum gurus can change their mind with their socks in terms of what the actual set of risks are. But we know that climate is always, but where are we exposed? What are the things that we need to be aware of? Where are we likely to be hit by floods? Where are we likely to hit by I mean, are we going to be hit by a grain shortage? It's actually thinking about those things in terms of the day-to-day operations that are significant for you, and it's all about a preparedness mindset. So it's not taking anything for granted. And I think if we switch those conversations to C-suite from risk to preparedness, then it's suddenly enabling. Because risk, as I said, when I first started presenting all this stuff, and people thought I was crazy, as I said, everybody said, but it's just too difficult. We can't do anything about all of this, and we play war games, and you make us feel so dismal at the end of it all. And how do we go about doing this? And I ran a couple of war games in a conference, one of which has turned out to be incredibly accurate. And afterwards, somebody came up to me and said, "Well, none of that will happen, but it's scary, isn't it?" And it's happened, and so it's. Had the mindset been there to go, this is what that means for me, and if the mindset isn't there when you're playing a war game to change things, then you have to go, right, what can we do, not what can't we do, what can we do? And that's preparedness.
And if you're not prepared to do anything, you may as well not do the war game at all. The war game is a means to an end, it is not the end in itself. A question from Rod. With the multilateral rules-based system centred on the 1947 institutions creaking, do you think that the more plurilateral approach hinted at by Mark Carney in his striking speech and advocated by thinkers like Moises Naim might start to come to the fore?
So for me, the biggest message from Mark Carney was, actually, let's be complacent anymore. He said this is a huge opportunity, and can different systems coexist? Absolutely, different systems can coexist. It's not something that we should be surprised about or suspicious about. I think, however, there is one fundamental problem. While you see a huge transition like this going on, a shift away from, you know, an American hegemony across the world to a more plurilateral state and in the world. And if you think about where the Middle East sits in all of this and the tensions in the Middle East, which you know, again, we talk about them sometimes and then they go away and we don't talk about them for a little while and then they come back again, and you know, we're not really thinking about Saudi Arabia and the UAE and you know, all of those types of things and how that's playing out in Sudan. You know, I could just list a list of things that are going on. The problem underneath all of this is that the battle for the 21st century at the moment isn't the basketball passes at the front of the room. It isn't control of the existing multilateral rules-based order. It is control of the 21st century rules-based order, and that is going to be based on digital technologies, on artificial intelligence. And back in the olden days when I did my PhD, I did my PhD on the economics of technology, science and technology. One of the big pieces of work, we used to talk about paradigmatic shifts in technology. And the paradigmatic shift, techno-economic paradigm, is a load of economic nonsense really, but I mean, a techno-economic paradigm is when everything in society shifts. And every single, in relation to that new technology, because technology has changed the ways in which we interact together as humans. You know, do we watch our television as communities anymore, or do we all watch it on our smartphones as we're going home? Are we on YouTube rather than the BBC? All of these types of things, they are fundamentally shifting the way in which our human society works. And we are naive if we think that that isn't very, very, very profound. It is absolutely changing the way in which the social boundaries, the social norms, the accepted behaviours and the geopolitics of all of this work. Now, that on one level creates populism, because we have populist movement. It's because people don't know. They see climate change, they see politics, all of these things, and they don't know. They feel out of control. And there's this message out there that there's some people who are doing better than you, and that's not fair. And you know, that's undermining our politics. But then against all of that, you've got this breakdown in the social boundaries. We don't really know where they are anymore, and that gives rise to economic nationalism, because what's the role of a nation state in a world where data could be owned by any nation state? What's the role of nationalist politics and all of that? Yeah. And you could argue that this is actually the battle for the 21st century, is control over that data, that information and those networks, and actually the internet and money that underpins all of this. So I think yes, there is scope. We should all, as human beings, be able to exist in a plurilateral world. There is an opportunity for the middle ground, the centre ground, the Carneys of this world, to lead that debate forward, and he should. But I think we also have to acknowledge the magnitude of the challenge that we're facing.
Thank you. One final question from me before we start to wrap up today's session. If there was one change that you would ask the people on this call to make, or one action that they could take within their organizations that would help them before the next big shock appears, what would that be?
Don't forget the gorilla.
Love it. Love it. Thank you. So, Rebecca, thank you very much. I'm guessing that if our participants scan that QR code, they might get a bit of a direct link to your book, the Martin Wolf recommended book of the year for 2025, if you want to hear more about that. But thank you, Rebecca, for fascinating and thought-provoking session. And you know, our role as crisis leaders is to anticipate, not just react to crisis events. And that's very clear in what you've said. It's not good enough to just assume that the status quo will remain forever. It's not good enough to avoid seeking out the gorilla, and it's not acceptable not to do the planning, preparedness, rehearsal that is required to respond should those risks emerge. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I'm very grateful for you doing that. And thank you everyone for joining. I just wanted to give a heads up on our next webinar, which is on the 10th of February, a different but really fascinating perspective on crisis and risk. Richard Gaisford, who for over 30 years was chief correspondent for Good Morning Britain before hanging up his helmet at the end of last year. Richard's been on the front line of reporting in Ukraine, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East, a whole range of global crises and major events. He has a really interesting perspective from a number of different directions. Firstly, his analysis of some of those very big crises. Secondly, how organisations have communicated and or dealt with the media during those major crises, and also his own personal experience of risk management when you are in the very front line of a different kind of conflict, a kinetic conflict, compared with the economic conflict that we've been talking about today. So it does promise to be an equally fascinating session. In your follow-up email to this webinar, there will be a link to the invitation for the webinar next month with Richard. But for now, Rebecca, thank you again. Really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and I wish you all, as always, a crisis afternoon. Many thanks.